have Madee Miller, who will talk about the fabulous quilt exhibit upstairs, taking up both the FedEx Exhibition Hall and the Medgar and Murley Evers Exhibition Hall. A Jackson native, Miller earned her BFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, where she focused in fibers and material studies. She's worked in the exhibit section of MDAH since 2015. Help me welcome Madee Miller.
Drama. Entrance. All right. So, like Chris said, I am Madee Miller. My parents know me as Madeline, and they're like, oh my gosh, she's going by Madee all the time. So, I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself before I tell you all about this exhibit and kind of how I fit into the story. I did graduate from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. It was very cold. I did move back to Jackson. I did forget how hot it is here. It is so hot, and I moved in May, so there were 2 blizzards before I left. So going to the School of the Art Institute of Chicago gives you the opportunity to actually go to school in a museum. So being at a museum was a perfect fit, a natural fit, really. And so coming back to Jackson was great, especially with the 2 Mississippi Museum project happening. I was so excited to be here. I had no idea that I was going to get to use my actual degree to work on a textile exhibit. So win-win for me, hopefully for everyone else too. So I'm going to tell you about this exhibit that I worked on for 2 years, as of now, 2 years. It took a lot of time, and I'm going to try to guide you through what we did. There were some strange things that happened, some drama like any good story. And of course, a very happy ending, in my opinion. So let's get started. So here are all 40 quilts in the exhibit upstairs. Has anyone been upstairs to see the exhibit? Thanks, guys. That's awesome. It's great. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you haven't been, you can go up there after this. So these are all the 40 quilts we picked. It's a lot. We fill 8,000 square feet with these 40 quilts. They are pretty insane, and they all have these crazy stories attached to them. And I worked with Mary Lorenz, who's in the back, who's going to wave, because she did an amazing job. She actually started working on this project before I was even here at MDAH, and about a year later, I was added to the project to work with her. We are textile geeks, I would say. We actually love them and had a lot to bond over, but we also had an exhibit to do. There are about 200 quilts in the MDAH collection. So picking 40 was just like a small challenge, especially for 2 people that love quilts as much as we do. So we started looking through the collection. Mary had done a lot of research before I was brought on, like I said, and there was a lot to review and read and big things to pull out of collections and look at, but we did it and managed to find out that these quilts had a few things in common, but they were the very base level things, like they're in Mississippi or were brought to Mississippi. Most of them are handmade. Most of them were made by women, with the exception of 2, and they're quilts. So that was kind of a clear connection. But as far as trying to curate an exhibit that was going to, tell the story of how they were made, if we were going to talk about a pattern, if we were going to talk about a type or a use, they really didn't all collect into a good story that way. It turned out the most important part about these quilts was their story themselves, and that's kind of how we started figuring things out. So I'm going to show you a handful of them, kind of discussing the different types of stories that we go through. So this is The Hands That Pick Cotton, Now Help Pick Our Presidents, or Pick Our Presidents. There's a little confusion on that title. This is made by Geraldine Nash, and it was made in 2008. It was in honor of President Barack Obama and his inauguration. So it hung in Washington in January 2008. She was actually here, so I got to meet her at the opening, which was really, really cool. So this is a quilt that is telling a story visually. You're seeing it, you know what we're talking about. And then we have quilts that came with stories. So these 2 quilts were made by Narcissa Black, who is a white plantation owner, and Chaney Black, an African-American enslaved person on the Black plantation. These were donated with 1 other quilt to MDAH and 2 diaries that are Narcissa's, and she talks about the relationship she had with Chaney. They were both seamstresses and weavers, so all of this fabric was made, for the most part, by them. There are a number of quilts, so some of it is purchased. And they made these quilts together, and as far as we know, did develop a friendship based on that interpretation. Of course, we are just looking at the plantation owners' writings. These two are really powerful to us. The exhibits team may like them the best because of the story they came with. And it's very interesting to see how this cooperative worked through before, during, and after the Civil War. So this is a friendship quilt. It was actually made for a wedding. So I like to think of this one as the love story of the exhibit. Everyone that signed it was a part of the Hinds County quilting group, and they were all part of planning the wedding, I assume. So this is something that is interesting. It's also really cool looking. It's a Bismarck pattern. These two tell stories very differently. The first is a strip-style quilt made by Cora McIntosh, and it is telling the story through fabric. So these fabrics are kind of all over the place. There's some, I'm gonna do this. This is made from flour sacking. There's some bandana up at the top. I mean, these were used fabrics. And you can see some of the seam holes on one of the other flour sackings. And in that way, this one has its own story to tell about that time period when people were using flour sacking. And the other one came with a story, one that we don't think is historically accurate, but it's a good story, and who should get in the way of a good story? So we tell it as though it is not true. This quilt was made by a woman in Simpson County, I believe, and Marion County. She told her neighbor, who she gave it to, that she took this quilt and hid it in a hollow log so the carpetbaggers would not steal it. Now, we realized this was a utilitarian quilt, so the fact that a carpetbagger would really want this is crazy. Also, it's really heavy. It is the heaviest quilt in the entire collection, and it was actually something that we had to consider when we were hanging it. We had to really think about, is this actually going to be sturdy? And these two quilts tell stories through the maps. So this first one is capturing 1850. Panola County, the woman that made it in 1995. And she was quite enthusiastic about Panola County and the history of Panola County, to say the least. And the second one is the Mississippi Map Quilt. It is a gem to this exhibit. Everyone loves it. It's one of the first things you see, but it was made in 1902, so there are 75 counties on this map instead of the 82 that we now have. Don't ask me to list which ones they are, please. Okay, so we've started to develop this idea of a story, and that's what we're going to go with. And of course, one of the hardest parts that you don't think is the hardest part is coming up with a title for your exhibit. And after about 6 months, this came to me with such ease that I was worried that it was going to be really bad. It was one of those things where I double-guessed myself. But Stories Unfolded came to be, and I fell in love with this font. I fell in love with the way the title was, and I fell in love with triangles. And you should all know that I love triangles so much that the exhibits team gives me a little bit of grief about it. And you may see why in a second. So the next thing we have to do is deal with the fact that we don't have a space that's complete. We're building something for a space that is kind of in flux at this point. This is late 2016. So this is the exhibits team at the time. There were only 3 of us. There are 4 now. We still handle about everything. And you can see through our blurry cell phone images that the space was truly incomplete. And if you look to the side, I think I have a laser. There we go. If you look here, you can see this doorway. This doorway became a problem for us because it was the last thing to be completed in this space. And it was actually super important because we were going to build out this space with a new wall so that we could protect the quilts because of the lighting. You can also see a theme that will reoccur throughout the story. These are all light fixtures hanging here. It was really dark in there all the time, and dark in there until about 2 days before we opened. So, drama, I told you guys. Wasn't lying. But you can see how big this space is, and I will show you just how large it is. So this is the full space. It's about 8,000 square feet. That's a lot of houses. That's kind of how I look at it. So there are 3 gallery spaces, and we're trying to deal with how do we get people through the gallery space, and so that they're looking at everything. We're not doing this in a linear fashion like you would see a typical exhibit might be in a chronological order or a thematic order. We don't really have that. But we did have a lot of measurements, and when I say a lot of measurements, we spent a lot of time taking measurements. Probably 3 or 4 trips over here we took them. At one point, we did not even have a floor plan. Barbara McClendon drew this fantastic floor plan on the spot, and it did become super handy. But we're also looking at a space that's 8,000 square feet that's just, around. We don't have these central walls, so we had to build in these walls here and there that were separating some of the space, which you'll see in a second. And those are called Miller walls, which is over here on my desk. Did I mention that I'm not very organized? So over here on the desk, we're looking at these modular units and trying to figure out how to fit these quilts onto them. We had 3 different heights for walls. Our ceiling height was at a different level, and it truly was unlevel at some points. So we had to start figuring out what quilts are actually going to fit on our physical walls and what are going to fit on our 98-inch walls. So certain things immediately got cut, including a quilt that was like 122 inches long. That just wasn't going to fit on any of our walls. They're 118 inches. So it was just going to be dragging the floor. And if you think about putting that on a platform, it's a really large bed at that point. People really want to hang out in it. So at this point, we didn't have a CAD program, which is a 3D software that allows you to set up this room or any room, and so you can go through it and put everything in and do all the measurements right, and it's really, really helpful when you're developing an exhibit, because especially in one that you've never really been in a space. But Lucy Allen is the best, and she went up to bat to get me this program, and sure enough, I was able to build these drawings of the space, putting these Miller walls, which are a modular unit, together, and putting all of our quilts in their places, all of our wall patterns into their places. And that became helpful not only to us so that we knew how to go further with this project, but also everyone then knew what was in my head for the past year, which was really great for me. So as you can see, the space is really large, and the Miller walls I'm talking about are these units here that are added on. They're 1 meter wide, and they are fantastic. They were a really good investment for us as far as making the space really versatile. They're also great for blocking out light, because we do have these 15-foot window doorways. And since it was a textile exhibit, as I think you may know, textiles are super sensitive to light, and we're already doing this exhibit for our fair a long time for a textile exhibit. So it's really important that we immediately figure out how to close this off. So I'm going to go into, I know I went into a few of the stories about some of the quilts, but I'm going to go into some of our thought process as far as how we laid them out. Some of those having to do with actual space, and some of those having to do with themes that we picked out to really try to discuss in a bigger way. This is the entrance area. So we have these triangles reoccurring. I was not joking about loving triangles. They made it really easy for us to be able to have people moving through the space and kind of understand, using them as a directional path. We also used, because it's 8,000 square feet, the space was originally all white. A dove wing is the color that we use. 8,000 square feet with quilts on the wall was going to look very bland, as much as we tried to, as pretty as the quilts were. So we decided to start using some color blocking to highlight certain themes that happened amongst a couple of quilts. So these 3 quilts are actually seen with a burgundy red color upstairs. They're all made by enslaved people from Mississippi. So we felt it was important to have these 3 together so they could stand together. These are stories that are missing. These are names that are missing that we'll probably never have. and they are very important to the story. We move further to where I have to start talking about the shorter wall. So the Miller walls are 10 inches shorter than our standard structural wall. So the quilts that could fit on there were a limited number. We had to put some of the smaller ones. And so these 3 went up at the bottom, went up because they were smaller. These 2 are actually hung in an interesting way. They are hung with magnets along the edge because they are very thin. So putting what you'll see in a minute, our mounting mechanism was not going to be, it wasn't an option at all. One of them is, the middle one is mostly silk, or all silk, and a lot of it is shattered, so it wasn't going to be able to support a thread and needle. And the other one is just a quilt top. So we didn't really have much to sew into at all. And then again, you see the Narcissa Black and Chaney Black quilts. It was important for us to have those separated so that they would be together and tell that story and bring that story together in a way that people could reflect on. There's actually a bench right here so that people can sit down and kind of think through that full story. It is a lot. There's a lot to read up there. The next 2 were huge. They're, as you can see, 101 inches and 92 inches. If they were hung next to any other quilt besides each other, they made everything look miniature. It was very odd and not very pleasing to the eye. And then these 2 were picked together because they are both wedding gifts. This is an outdraft, not a quilt. We move into the 3rd room, which is the largest room. It is over 3,000 square feet. It is very, very big and just very open. We added 1 area of wall to try to cut that space in half in a way without keeping you from being able to see the rest of the exhibit, because if you get cut off and you don't realize that there's half a room left, you might not get to see the whole thing. So this is one of my favorite stories that we tell. Both of these quilts were made during the Great Depression, and the one they're actually hung differently than this. The slave chain quilt was made by an African-American woman who used this quilt. You can see the stains along the neck, which I realize is kind of gross. But it's an old quilt, and it was used, it's torn apart. It was made with some flower stacking here and there, but mostly reused fabrics. Where, on the other hand, the quilt that looks similar in color was made with all new fabrics by a white woman from Hinds County who sent her daughter to dances in Coffeyville every quarter, we think, based on how long it took to this quilt. She would get her to get a couple of different colored yardage of this pattern, and so she just started doing it. It's tiny squares. It's definitely worth going to look at just because it's kind of insane. But getting to see those 2 next to each other as far as what an African-American woman was making versus what a privileged white woman was making in Mississippi. I mean, I don't think this was ever used. Another thing that we tried to highlight was families that were somehow related in the quilts. So we have an aunt and her niece who made quilts together, and then we have a mother and a daughter who made quilts, all 4 of whom are well known in the quilting world. So those are hanging next to each other to try to connect the families and talk about how this craft has been passed down for many years. We also talk about scrap quilts, which are really popular. This quilt looks as though it might be blue. We all thought it was blue. It's white. Color balance is really important, but we definitely were surprised when we received that, and it was white. I did mention that there were 2 male quilters in our collection. This is one of them right here. We felt it was important that he be a part of the exhibit. He pieced that quilt top possibly while he was in Tennessee being treated for tuberculosis. How exciting. Apparently that was like a therapeutic thing that people did, was learn to make quilts. So now we have to do the gallery prep. Gallery prep for exhibits is pretty intense, especially a space this large, and we didn't have a lot of time by the time that we were able to actually get in here and start doing things. We also didn't have any light. I told you that'd be a theme. So we were using shop lights, which were, fine. They were fine. They were really bright, and they get really, really hot. But here we are setting up the Miller wall sections. This is that temporary wall that I was talking about. It does take about 3 people to set each section together. It's really cool. We can break it down and move it around. We set those up pretty early on, and we were able to get the space, the proper measurements to make sure everything was going to be great. Now, when you're dealing with artifacts, especially like this, where they're being basically directly put onto the wall, it's super vital that your paint off gas. So as soon as we finished painting, a timer started for 2 weeks before we could put anything in the space, which means you think you're almost there, and then you can't do anything for 2 weeks. Of course, we had plenty to do. Don't worry about it. And I wanted to point out one thing that we did do. We did hand paint those triangles that if you go upstairs, they're pretty pristine. This is painter's tape, but it also is painter's caulking on it, so that gives you a really clean line in case you want to do that at home. And this is our laser level, which was a really handy thing that we recently acquired. If you turn it on its side, it gives you a perfect right angle, and you can get yourself a great triangle. So this took, I would say, about 3 weeks. When I'm looking for a nod, you'd say 3 weeks. Okay, so this took about 3 weeks. We were doing a lot of other things while this is happening. So we're doing fabrication, we're writing the text labels, we're also dealing with the fact that we're opening 2 museums. This is all happening at the same time, which is minorly stressful, but also super exciting. I mean, it just keeps going. This is one of the last pictures we took of the space. You can see all the triangles throughout. And in the end, we used about enough paint to probably paint 3 houses reasonably. I also don't recommend using the color twilight blue unless you are really looking for something to be mad about, because that color has some strange coverage, and the front wall does have 6 coats of paint on it. Now we're really good at painting. I don't think we felt very good about it at first, but towards the end, we were like, we're professional painters now. So now we're moving into what we're going to do with the actual quilts. We used a very interesting mounting method. I didn't want to use rod pockets. I'm being straight up honest, I don't like the tube that a rod pocket creates. I didn't want that buckle on any of the quilts. And they're a little bit difficult to hang on the actual wall because you're using like a round cleat. I wanted the quilts to be flat on the wall and flow a little bit, which is one of those things that Collections and I had to really meet in the middle about, which is part of being an exhibit designer, is working with your collection staff, who did an awesome job on this, and them telling you that you're being insane. So what we ended up doing was using 1x4s to mount Velcro to them. So there's a strip of Velcro on them. We are the wall in this picture. This is the quilt. So it goes here. There's some Velcro on that, a slat of it, and Mylar, because we really don't want our quilts to touch paint. And on the quilt itself is this sort of stitched on canvas backing with Velcro on it. And that is how we attach the quilts. That's how we got them very crisply all the way across. Also something you can do at home. And these are the actual mounts themselves. So it was important that each of them be they were particular to the quilt, because every single one of them was not only a different length. Every end of the quilt is different. We had the curved edges, we had the straight edges, we had the edges that were so wonky you didn't even know how they made the quilt. None of them were right. So this was one of those things that we had to work I knew I was going to mess up once. We had to work pretty hard to get each of these the right color paint labeled on the back, and the right edges too. And this is Barbara and Sam hanging one of them. So these went up on the wall pretty early because they could go up before the artifacts went up. And these are our ladders that became super handy. Typically, I would be standing right here, but I think I was getting something. That's how I captured this picture. But we do have double-sided ladders. It's a great thing when hanging stuff. I talked about the Mississippi Map Quilt briefly. It actually is one of the quilts that needed a lot of conservation to go on display for this exhibit. Despite it being the smallest, it may have been one of the most tedious to work with, but it's beautiful. It was made in 1902, and it has a lot of silk on it, which is then would have been weighted silk, and that deteriorates the actual fabric. So there are a lot of losses in this quilt, and it is on velour. So it needed to be displayed flat. Thank goodness it was small, because remember that one that I said would have been about 11 feet bed? This one was much smaller and totally manageable. So this is sort of the drawing that we work with, and this is how it turned out. John Gardner built this. He's amazing. Does a really good job. Craftsmanship is pristine on this, and this quilt is protected, and it was able to be displayed so that everyone could see it. So this is probably, the whole project, I think everyone might call that my baby, as far as I've spent 2.5 years dealing with this. This was my favorite part of the project. I wanted to do a case so people could see the tool, so you're not just seeing quilts, we're talking more about actually quilting. And so we came up with a tool case, which initially was designed to just be a standard tabletop case. That was kind of boring. So the Miller walls came in, and they have windows in them. So we built this very large shadow box that hooks on the back of the window. And half of the labels are inside, and half are outside, made with vinyl. So this is one of those things that when I'm trying to explain it to the other exhibit staff members, I got a couple of strange looks. And that happened periodically, especially with this one. So I wanted a shadow box so that we could have this layered theme playing throughout, because quilts are layers, that kind of thing. Of course, I want to touch on the fact these two pictures right here are props. We don't treat our artifacts like this. These are props, and these are artifacts. Those are in collection storage. These are in the exhibit workshop. We keep them separate until installation. So we had to do mounts for all of these, and Barbara handled that. This is one of the most beautiful thimbles I've ever seen in my whole life. This is difficult to shoot because the lighting in the actual space is quite dim, but that is how it turned out. And you can see that the tools of the trade is actually in the case, and then you have labels coming in from outside of the case, so we got multiple layers. A fun fact about this case is these Carters were Barbara McClendon's great-grandmothers, and my grandmother, because I was kind of jealous, to be honest. My grandmother wrote the labels for our dies because she has impeccable handwriting. We also had to figure out how to make cotton stay in a bowl without actually winding it, which was its own little challenge. It turns out if you gently spray very watered down Mod Podge over about 2 weeks, you will achieve the perfect sturdy cotton ball. And if you want your tape measure to curl, you have to put a piece of wire there, and you probably shouldn't do it the day before install, but if you do, it probably will look okay. That was one of those maybe 9:30 in the evening ideas that I had. So I talked a little bit about the dyes, and I hadn't talked much about the colors that we chose for the exhibit. They were inspired by the dyes that we were dealing with in the quilts. So Twilight, which is this color, is the main blue and the painful color to paint, but very pretty. It was inspired by indigo, which as you're pulling it out of the vat, it is green, and as it oxidizes, it turns blue. So that's what your jeans are supposed to be dyed with, and now it's very synthetic, but that's okay. It's a very difficult process, but I wanted somewhere in between where we're getting the green and the blue of that process. Madder root is also very popular in a lot of our quilts. You see a lot of red, a lot of orangey red, and so we chose iron ore red to go with that. Dovewing was already chosen for us, and yellow raincoat is one of those that we really needed a bright color for our interactive area that you'll see in a second, because we wanted kids to go try to touch that and not the quilts. So this is part of the interactive area. In the initial drawing, it was going to be navy behind it. It is yellow, as I said. So what we wanted was something that people could go and create their own patterns and be inspired without needing to bring markers and pins and things that you don't want in a quilt exhibit into a quilt exhibit. So we worked towards this, which we this is not an unpopular idea as far in the museum industry, because magnets are something that is clean and you can have in the galleries. It is the most popular part of the exhibit, and that's okay. That's really cool. People come in, we get to go in there pretty regularly and see what people have come up with. One time I went in there and someone had created a whale. That was pretty awesome. I don't know how they did it. We do have a picture somewhere. But these were hung at 3 different heights to not only abide by ADA rules, but also so that you could have kids at different sizes. These are one of our staff members' niece and nephew, who just happened to be really good at it. And so you can see, like, someone's able to pull up with a wheelchair. That was something that was important to us and always is important. But also, you have one at adult height, too, because we wanted to encourage adults to play as well. So I talked about how we were worried about people touching things. We wanted this area to be somewhere people could really touch. All of the quilts, with the exception of 2, are, I might eat my words when I say this, but are touchable. Don't go touch them. But, you're able to get this close. There is no barrier between you except your own conscience. So it was important for us to make it so that people could understand the processes that we were referencing in our labels. We talk about applique, we talk about embroidery, we talk about the fabrics, we talk about trapunto, and those are things that you are very tactile and you want to touch them. I mean, I want to touch all the quilts. They look so soft. And it's really cold in museums. So we built this table design out of kind of a modular unit, so we can build multiple of these and redo them with different tabletops, like up there. So this is kind of the base model. And this is what we came up with. This is a tabletop that's about at kiddish height. And you can touch it and deal with actual quilt blocks. This is the actual printer's sketch. You can feel the 3 different types of batting: wool, cotton, and polyester. I know there are more, but those are the 3 we chose. And so you can see these 4 quilt blocks, which I, as a textile major, should have known how to quilt well, but I had to learn for this. They're still not great. I'm working on it. So this is somewhere that people are able to get the feel for what the actual quilts would be like. And much to our surprise, it has not gotten as dirty as I thought it would. I worked in a children's museum for a year before coming here, and everything gets so gross. But I guess history museum people are cleaner. I don't know. I mean, there are kids standing there. They thought it was fun. So something to touch on there is that we did all of this in-house with the exception of 2 items that were printed, which are that tabletop and those magnets. Those were outsourced. We designed all of it, but those were printed because we didn't have the capabilities at the time. So we put all the vinyl on the walls. That was a fun time. This is another one of those, Madee might be going crazy things. Vinyl is typically opaque on your walls because why would you put translucent vinyl on your wall? But I thought it would look cool, and it does. It did. It looks very interesting. We were going to put a gray up there, but there was something very stark about having the arrows. And so since we used a transparent gray, it blended with the blue to give us this kind of interesting middle ground. We also have quotes throughout the exhibit to try to inspire. This is a favorite of one of our staff members. He quotes it on a regular basis. I won't name names. And then we'll get to the big drama. So the lighting was quite a problem. When, as you can see from this photo, you can't see much of anything. This is a very accurate depiction of what it looked like. At the beginning, our lights had incandescent bulbs in them, which not only meant that they were going to go out every 3 to 4 months, it also meant that we really didn't have that much light. So it was important for us to immediately switch to some LED lights. Those pictures were taken about 3 hours apart from each other. And you can actually see, these are not pointed at anything, they're just there. But we started to work on this and figure out, well, we actually don't have enough lights to light this exhibit at all. We were short about 100 fixtures at that point, and we were really down to the wire. So once we'd seen this was kind of the first time we actually saw the lights turned on. They had not been turned on yet. Quick action, got new lights in there, new bulbs, and began working on figuring out how we were going to get new fixtures. And everyone got on board with that. That was a very collaborative effort, and anyone that was involved, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. So we ended up getting lights 2 days before the exhibit opened. 100 and something lights of the actual lamps themselves that needed to be in our fixtures, and there are a ton of filters that go into our fixtures. Because we were dealing with light-sensitive objects, we had to cut a lot of light down, which sounds counterintuitive now that I've said we didn't have enough light and then we're taking it away. But they only have so much beam, so we needed multiple. Here is the exhibits team working pretty hard. This is the scaffolding that we were able to acquire. In order to move on the scaffolding, you did need to lay down and use the pipes. We have pipe support throughout. They're not like water pipes. They're actually pipe support in our space. Just want to, no one have a heart attack. So we were using the grid pipes that we have so that we can hang heavier objects to move these around. They're very big, and some staff members are afraid of heights and still got on them. So go team. This is from how high you were, as far as that's the top of one of the quilts. So you were up there. But like I said, we're also cutting the light out because we were dealing with textiles. So this was an important thing to address early on. So you see the entrance wall when you walk into the exhibit, and then you turn and you see, why is the gallery so dark? And that's where we get to explain, it is dark in there. And if you go in there, you will think that you can't read anything. Just let your eyes adjust for a second. So after we had the exhibit up, and we were open, there were still a number of things that we needed to do, like get people into the exhibit. So we went ahead and started working on vinyl for the actual space. So if you go out into the lobby and look up, you can see this top picture. If you go to the stairs, you'll see the side picture. We do have lifts, so we were able to do that again all in-house. This is Sam. I'm sitting on the other lift. It was really nerve-wracking. They move a lot. And then the rest of our staff is leaned over. It was a fun Tuesday, Monday, Tuesday. Another really big project for this was our catalog. This was the first exhibit in the new two Mississippi museums, and we felt that it was important to have a catalog for this exhibit to honor it and to remember it in the long run. So we created this catalog, Stories Unfolded. Funny title. And these are 3 shots from it. So we have a foreword that really talks about from the exhibit's perspective of what our highlights are for the actual exhibit, what our favorite quilts are. And I know you're not supposed to pick favorites, but we did. And telling some of those stories that really shaped the exhibit itself. And then we have Mary Lorenz wrote a wonderful essay about quilting in Mississippi and the history of that throughout and kind of how that relates to the exhibit. And then we go into all the quilts where we talk more about the stories that we're telling than we were able to in the exhibit. We limited how much text we were going to give for that exhibit because we knew there would be a lot of gallery fatigue if we did that. So all of the labels in Stories Unfolded are actually under 150 words. But in the book, there's a lot more information. And of course, you don't really want to buy a book that just says exactly what you already read. It seems counterintuitive. We also developed a gallery guide or discovery guide, which is really aimed towards families coming into the exhibit. One way to keep your kids from touching all of the quilts, but also a way to engage in a different way than just reading labels and saying, oh, it's pretty. Look how lovely that is. Grandma made me one of those. So this kind of goes into all aspects of the exhibit. We're talking about how to tell your own story in a story quilt. We're talking about Mississippi history. And we talk a fair amount about some of the tools that are used in highlighting that, but also give kids or adults the opportunity to color this in and keep the whole thing, but you can rip that off and put it on your fridge. I think people still do that. And the last thing we wanted to add was somewhere for people to tell their own stories about quilts. So this is our feedback wall, which is probably one of the most alike things as far as looking at a drawing and then looking at it actually made. So this feedback wall went in and we put in different prompts. So we have draw your favorite quilt pattern, draw what your quilt would look like, tell your quilt story, what did you learn, who inspired you in this exhibit, those kind of questions, leading questions. But we've gotten a lot of response from our visitors about that, who are telling these touching stories. One about their cat, Steph Purry, which is one of my favorites. But also we have, on an actual touching level, we recently got one about Hurricane Katrina, which is very appropriate for the date that we are here. And a woman had made a quilt had a quilt that her grandmother had, and they had it hung in a store in Pass Christian, and they were so worried that it had gotten blown away after Katrina, but it turns out the family that evacuated took this from the store, took the quilt with them, and so they now have that safe at home, and I think it becomes more special knowing that they might have missed it. So stories like that, if you have them, we'd love for you to come and tell them, or write them rather, or tell me. I love to hear it. But that's all I have for you. That's how we did Stories Unfolded. So I'm happy to take any questions whatsoever if you have. Hopefully I can answer them. It's not on. I can hear you because I have super hearing. Yeah. It's a very good question. The question is, how long did it take us to put the mounting fabric on the back of the quilts? Is this like off? So that's the question. How long did it take us to do that? It took about 3 months putting them on. Should I take this off?
No, I think we got it now.
Okay. I don't want to be yelling and then. So it took us about 3 months. That took the majority of the collection staff worked on that. We had some volunteers help us. It's all a hand stitch, and I can't remember what that hand stitch is called. Collection staff. It looks like a mountain. It crosses like this, very wide. It's sort of like a zigzag. I'm happy to draw it out for you. But yeah, that did take a lot of time, and not every quilt was hung that way, but the majority of them were.
At the beginning, you have a picture with depicting a black person showing from plantation, growing cotton, to actually engaging in quilt production, kind of towards Obama. I'm wondering if when exactly, or if there's a time frame when blacks got involved in making quilts, whether it's during the time of slavery, or after slavery, after emancipation, or during the 19th century. Do you have an idea of when blacks got involved in
in quilting itself.
Yes.
Mary might have a better idea of that than I would, since she did most of the research.
Okay. Hey, I'm Mary Lorenz. I was hired on contract to curate the exhibit for Archives and History. African Americans have played a very important part in quilting in America, and that has been ever since people of African descent or Africans were brought here to Mississippi. So enslaved persons have made wonderful quilts. We have 3 that are on exhibit in Stories Unfolded. 2 others are on permanent exhibit in the new museums. Usually you don't have a maker's name associated with a quilt made by an enslaved person, but in the Museum of Mississippi History is a striking, beautiful, vibrant diamond mosaic quilt made by Millie's Lake, an enslaved person. So as far as African American people making quilts, that has happened from the very early times to the present, and all types of quilts too. Out of the Stories Unfolded quilts, there are 40 and 18 are African American made.
Once the display is taken down, where will the quilts go from here? Or when will it be displayed again? And then you mentioned that there were a lot of others that you didn't get to put up. When will we be able to see those?
So they'll go into our collection storage, where they will be very safe and not be in the light anymore, because they really need a break. As far as when you can actually see the rest of the quilts, that is a collections question entirely. The ones that are hanging, some of the ones that are hanging in our museums will have to rotate because they are textiles, so we will be able to show more and more of our quilts throughout time.
Thank you for your presentation. The last time I visited the quilting area, I don't remember listening or don't remember hearing any genre of music to accommodate the exhibit of all of the different types of quilts that are up there. Do you have music to...
Do we have music that goes with the exhibit? We do not.
Have you considered it?
We did talk about doing music, a playlist at some point, but based on copyrights and the general, little lack of time and resources, that was something that we didn't feel was important at that point. I would love to hear your suggestions on music, though.
Are there any particular part of the state where most of the quilts have been collected, like Cultural Crossroad? I believe Gwen Nash is from that area.
Right. We do have a lot of quilts from Port Gibson area. It seems to be a very popular place for quilting. Of course, Mississippi Cultural Crossroads is there, so it is a hot spot automatically. It'd be safe to say that the majority of our quilts in the collection are more from central Mississippi than other areas, and that's something that the collection will expand eventually and hopefully cover the full state.
I guess I had a couple of questions since you're over textiles for the museum. The same thing would apply, I guess, to the flags in the museum. Are those going to be rotated, or are they conserved to a point that they're...
Yes,
okay.
we have a lot of flags from what I understand also. Yes, they will rotate. I actually work in exhibits, so the only reason that I was... Not the only reason, but the main reason I know about textiles is from my degree, and this just happened to be a good fit as far as we were having a textile exhibit.
And I have one other question, maybe not for you, but can we get a tease on what might be next in these two spaces after the quilt exhibit is down?
Well, immediately after the quilt exhibit is down, the next exhibit will be Possum Ridge, which you may be familiar with. Our train exhibit is expanding and moving over here, and that will fill the first couple of months of No Stories Unfolded. The rest is, you'll find out soon. Can I miss it? Okay, so the next exhibit is Spirits of the Passage. It's a traveling exhibit that will open in February of 2019, discussing the transatlantic slave trade. Just wasn't sure if I could say that yet.
How do you acquire these quilts? Do people just step up and offer them, or is there a market for them?
Is there a market for, we
Acquire
multiple ways we are collecting. So a lot of these were donated to people, from people that just knew they couldn't take care of them like they should, or wanted to share the story about the quilt with us. Others are different. There's not really, I wouldn't say there's a market for it. We're not going out and purchasing a bunch of quilts, but yeah.
I just
Next.
think everything kind of good and good. I like that. I speak me.
He's bringing you the mic. Right here.
You talked about the silk fabric being used and how it deteriorates quicker. That's been my experience with some I have inherited. And you just leave it. Typically, do you just leave it deteriorated, or do you
Do we try to repair it or replace?
Yes.
We, from my understanding, we don't replace things unless it's part of a structural integrity. If you can leave it, that particular quilt has some netting over the areas to stabilize the area, but we're never going to go in and say, this pink silk's gone, let's put a new piece. We don't do that.
Other questions?
Everybody? Cool.
There are copies of the Discovery Guide over in the far end there. We have the exhibit catalog, Stories Unfolded, at a discount price for everyone today. I think it's somewhere around $12.50 today only. It features all 40 of the quilts that are in there. Madee laid it out. It's gorgeous. You can come pick up a copy of that afterwards. And then after a few minutes, say maybe around 1:15, Madee will be upstairs in the galleries and will be available to answer any questions that you may have. If you haven't been up to see all these quilts, really take a few minutes today and go. It's gorgeous, and they are up through, you've got all next month and then part of October to see them, but it's well worth your time. Thank you all for coming today. I hope we see you next week. Help me thank Madee Miller for this program.